Hello, everyone. Hi, Nikita.
Wow.
Welcome to our webinar. So we'll begin in a few moments, but just for anyone who is joining, if you want to drop us a little note in the comments, just letting us know where in the world you are joining us from. Just for a little bit of introduction, my name is Kelly McGrath-Smith and I am the Community Director here at Hire. We're really delighted to have you all join us today. I guess for those of you who may be new, if you don't know who we are at Hire, we are a free to join global community of internal talent and HR folk. So at the moment, we've got over 10,000 members and growing. And in essence, we like to think of ourselves as the hive mind of global TA, really kind of united on a mission to help level up the industry. And as part of that mission, we bring you these wonderful weekly webinars that we host here on LinkedIn Live, and then also carry the conversation over on our Slack channel. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Nikita, who will be leading today's webinar all around the truth about psychometric assessment, as you can see from our lovely slide here. So what we'll do is we will hand over to Nikita just to do a little bit of an intro in a moment. But if you are new, like I said, if you're not part of our community, you can join by going to hirehq.com. So I'll put a little banner there just so it's easy for everyone. And we're really looking forward to this session. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So do feel free to drop us a note in the comments, let us know what you think. And like I said, drop us a note, let us know where you're joining from as well. But before we start, I will hand over to you, Nikita, if you would like to give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kaylee, and thank you for having me on. So, just a little bit of narcissism from myself. But before we go on to it, what I would love you to do is that if you can scan the little QR code here and or enter the little code at the top on the website called menti.com, because going back to Kelly's point, we would like to make this interactive, and Mentimeter will allow us to do so. So you can either scan the cheeky QR code here or go to menti.com and type in this code 24721127, and that will allow you to participate as we go along. But just a little bit of narcissism from me. So my name is Nikita, and I classify myself as a chief neuroticism officer. The reason for this, there's been a lot of chief happiness officers running about LinkedIn, and I thought, well, somebody needs to fly the flag for a negative emotional affect, so why not me? I'm quite obsessed with personality. You might say, Nikita, how obsessed are you? Well, I profiled my wife to be with 2 psychometrics before I proposed. You can't leave high consequence decisions in selection to one assessment. Purely responsible, if you ask me. But it gets better. I was meeting my colleague and mentor, Wendy, for a few pints, as you do. And she goes like, how are you? And I go, I think I met the one. And she goes, what's her name? And I go, Olga. So Wendy goes, show me Olga. So what do? I take out her Neo-PIR psychometric profile, give it to Wendy. She looks at it, reads it, puts it down and goes, mate, you totally lost it. I meant the picture. That's how I see her, you know. So I have worked for 3 different publishers in my career. So people who actually, create those psychometric assessments that you so kindly use and pay for, and we validate them, norm them, all that good stuff. Then about 6 years ago, I embraced the unemployability of my personality and became a consultant. So now I work with organizations, teams. We also do couples and as well as individuals, coaching, team builds, all of that stuff, but also providing continual professional development in upskilling people to use psychometrics. By the way, since being married now for a few years and doing couple sessions, I can attest that what they say about marriage is true. It is really psychological. One tends to be the more psycho, the other one tends to be the more logical, and I'm the more psycho one in my relationship. So aren't you lucky for the next 55 minutes? But that's enough about me. What would be wonderful to hear is about you. What's your relationship with psychometrics? Have you used them? Have you completed them? Or you're wondering, what are we talking about on this webinar today? And you just decided to come into it because it's better than sunshine. So yeah. And Kelly, what's your experience with psychometrics so far?
I've done a few. And I really like doing them because I love to kind of get the results back and see, oh, is this true to me? Does it ring true? We actually did one quite recently here at Talentful around the colors. So, what is your color profile? And I find them quite interesting from like a team dynamic perspective, not necessarily from a hiring assessment perspective. So I've never used them to hire talent or have them as part of my hiring process when I'm recruiting, but I have used them from like understanding the dynamics of a team. And I'm someone who, like, I love a survey. I love like any sort of polar survey. I'm just all over it. So if someone gives me a test, I'm like, yes, I will do it. So I find it quite interesting.
Fantastic. And you're not the only one. And people have been finding them for a very long time. But you hit on a very important point there, that there's basically two main applications of psychometrics. One is selection, so how we select people based on their results, and one is development, so coaching, development, team builds, and all that stuff, and how we communicate. But the key thing is there's lots of different assessments. So when it comes to psychometrics, here's a few. One, it's ability assessments. So it's like assessing your attention to detail, or critical reasoning by analyzing like lots of text and trying to deduct stuff from it. Spatial reasoning, where you're presented with different shapes and you need to identify which ones you kind of want to do. There's also numerical reasoning, such as, mathematical abilities and also that. But there's lots of reasonings. There's literally thousands of different ability assessments. Some can be really general abilities, and some can be like super specific. So there's a whole range of them. And the internet is full of different platforms like Assessment Day, which allows you to practice different assessments. So if you want to look for how they look like in practice, you can try them out. Then you have, of course, personality, and then we have the different color models. You also have Myers-Briggs, God bless it. You have OPQ32, you have NEO, you have Luminous Spark, LMAP, Rorschach, that's the ink blot tests. That's still personality, because it kind of, the idea is they present you set stimuli. So the ink blots, they're actually top secret. The publisher really doesn't want them to be released and known. There's only 2 ink blots which are floating around, so it's very difficult to find them. They're still printed in Italy on like original paper, and it's really kind of like, really strong on it. The idea is they present you those ink blots, and you need to identify like, what do you see in them? And the idea is what you project on the set stimuli tells you about your personality. Hence, they're called projective assessments of personality. Then you have culture psychometrics now popping up. I just know one of them for now, called Culture Scope. So it looks at psychometric culture of the organization and behaviors and what's acceptable, what's not. That's quite fun. You also had implicit association tests, which were a little bit more of all the rage about 5 years ago. So identify, like, do you have biases against particular demographics of groups? And now you have AI, which nobody really knows what it is. So to me right now, AI is basically a Rorschach or a projective psychometric, because when you ask people what they see in AI, it usually tells you more about the person than it does about AI. So if a person says that, they're more anxious by nature, they'll say, oh my God, it's going to destroy us. Well, and people who are a bit more optimistic, oh, it's going to solve the climate crisis for us. So right now, AI is quite ambiguous. And currently what people think of AI tells you more about the personality of people thinking about AI than it does about AI. So that's the types. There's different formats. So self-report, as Kelly mentioned, you love filling out those surveys.
Mhm.
Those are exactly self-report. You're reporting on yourself. Then you have 360. It's when other people fill out surveys about you. There's also gamified assessments, which are like, you download an app and you play a game. They're now also called behavioral based assessments. So it's either a gamification or BBA. So, like, it wasn't difficult enough to remember already. But it's quite an interesting sphere. And but please be careful with this, especially in selection, because if, let's say, thing says, publisher goes, we're more inclusive of neurodiversity and all of this, but actually with previous assessments, when you need to make a reasonable adjustment, as it's called, in selection, You could at least, an ability assessment, you could print it out. You can give it to people in A3 if it was made it easier for them. Give them markers so they can highlight what they read. The material allowed you to edit it and actually makes a reasonable adjustment. But with gamified assessments, if you download the app, what reasonable adjustments can you make to the app? What reasonable adjustments can you make to somebody's phone? It's actually a big question mark. So pro tip, if people say it's more inclusive of neurodiversity, ask them, how do they know this? Did they pair up with a university to conduct a study in this? Is the original group of people the research has been done on in creation of the psychometric included individuals with neurodiverse conditions? And by the way, autism and ADHD doesn't exist in isolation. Sometimes you have what's called comorbidity. It's when ADHD and autism go together. If you want to know more about this, I highly suggest talk to people who work in schools with special education needs. They will tell you so much more than a consultant about how different neurodiverse conditions play out. Or better yet, if you don't want to just you want to work with adults, go to an educational psychologist or a neuroscientist or an actual person who understands this, and ask them, can I have your opinion on this? Never take publisher's voice for, like, just because they say so doesn't make it true. I apologize, but it isn't. And I'll explain later why this really matters. Then you have projective assessments and you have AI. However, it's going to promise to assess your personality, such as identify patterns and words they use on Twitter. What happens if you don't use Twitter? What happens if you don't use Facebook? And their validity study is based on the Facebook correlations. Is how people use Facebook the same how they use LinkedIn? We don't know. So this is a very brave new world, and we'll see what emerges there. But right now, I treat it with so much attention, because what I found, what's much more troubling right now, people bash MBTI. It's not scientific. You know how much scientific research, peer-reviewed research with academia, as MBTI publishers did over the last 80 years? Loads. You can go into Google Scholar next time you have trouble sleeping. Really helps you with getting you to sleep. And you can type in MBTI and performance and MBTI and other assessments such as the Big Five, and you'll find peer-reviewed research about this. And right now, a lot of AI goes, we're scientific, we're neuro-informed, whatever. And they have zero papers. They have zero research. And they say, we can't share anything with you because it's in a black box. And they don't really know how the algorithm works. And you go, interesting. So right now, a lot of assessments which claim to be new and super scientific, I would say, are actually less scientific than MBTI. And that's saying something in regards to marketing. So sometimes just because somebody says they're scientific, they're based on neuroscience, doesn't make it so. Like, everything is based on neuroscience. Everything that's created around you, which you perceive as in your brain. So anything that assesses what's going on inside your head is neuroscience. So, just please have a huge grain of salt and consult an expert before trusting a publisher. Hopefully that doesn't sound too cynical. But the key thing is, what I want you to kind of keep in mind is that all the psychometrics, be it self-report, 360, even AI, be it MBTI, OPQ, NEO, what have you, they're all measuring the same elephant. So it's like in that old proverb of blindfolded people need to figure out what animal it is by touching an elephant. And because they're all touching different parts, they're getting different textures. So they make different assumptions. So somebody's touching like a leg and they go, it's a rhinoceros. Somebody's touching a tail, it's like a snake. Somebody's touching a trunk and probably saying, I don't know what the hell it is. But the key thing is that they all think it's different animals. So if there's one thing you take away from today, is that all of these different animals is the same phenomenon. It's different perspectives of phenomenon of individual differences, which we call personality. So it's just different angles on the thing. And therefore, this is very important, because there's a lot of arguments being made, like type assessments like MBTI versus trait assessments like the Big Five. Just complete nonsense. It's and, because you have trait, people who score in the middle, and you have type, people who score really high on one side and low on the other, such as if you have somebody who scores really high extroversion, really low introversion, E explains them very well sometimes. And then if you have somebody who scores high on I and low introversion and low extroversion, I explains them quite well. And people in the middle, trait, explains it quite well when the mix of both, which is called ambiversion. By the way, this is one of my favorite biases to address in personality, because people say, extroverts are lively, sociable, all of this, and introverts are like so withdrawn and not sociable. It's completely wrong, because introverts are extroverts with good taste. They're just more selective of who they want to socialize with and what they're excited about outwardly. So the key thing is what we can learn from different assessments, how they can complement each other. Same as you can be using a couple of different personality assessments in selection if they each give something new to the assessment. Like a lot of companies use, for example, NEO-PIR or now PI3 and Hogan assessment, dark side together. And they get quite a lot of value. Or I had a colleague, just met him yesterday, and he uses a lot of Savile Wave with Luminous Spark, both personality assessments. But the way they use it, both give something, because it's just different perspectives on the matter. So, I mean, I ranted enough. Kelly, what are your thoughts so far?
I think it's really interesting. I think the elephant piece stuck out to me because I'd actually never heard that before. And it kind of conjures up that sense of actually people experience things very differently, right? And I think when you were talking around kind of introversion, extroversion, I've always identified more on the introversion side, but equally, I think with more conversations around ambiverts and actually being in that middle, I don't see myself personally as being an introvert who doesn't love spending time with people. I just need to recharge in different ways. And I think sometimes the descriptions of these words hopefully are, being redefined in terms of looking at it more from like a positive perspective as well.
Exactly. And there's also something that get lost in the wash, because what's really important when we talk about psychometric models, there's psychometric models like Big Five or personality models like DISC and Jung. And based on these models, tools are developed, such as MBTI was developed on Carl Jung's theory of personality. And Carl Jung says, he gives an analogy in his books that we're all like, think of a tiger, they have both paws. They just have a more dominant one that they strike with. So we all have like introversion and extroversion, and we're all ambiverts, and we're just a little preference here or a little preference there. But when it converted into an assessment that gives you either an I or an E, some of that nuance is lost. Of course, you have step 2 with MBTI, I believe, that gives you a little bit more detail as well. But we need to realize that whenever you see a psychometric that's based on a model, it's always an interpretation of it. Such as you have the Big Five model of personality for you more geeky out there, and you have different tools based on it, like Luminous Spark, NEO-PIR, Facet 5. And each one of these tools has a slightly different poetic license on their interpretation of the Big Five in their model. So don't confuse the model with the tool. The tool is based on the model, but each tool takes poetic license in interpretation of the model, how it's transferred into their tool. So that's enough geeky stuff. But the key thing is that needs to be presented a major difference before we go any further. There is, when we talk about personality, when we talk about research, when we talk about psychology, there's basically 2 streams. You have for-profit psychometric assessments, such as the ones you buy, which is very nice of you. Please keep buying, and there's a whole industry depending on you. But there's also the actual psychology and personality science. Now, my dad's a professor of applied mathematics and physics. So whenever I say I work in personality science, he has a few things to say. But let's put it this way. This is for my therapy room, not for this webinar. But the key thing is that there is this research that goes on. So let's say if you use a psychometrics that's first been designed in the 1940s, right? It's 80 years ago. So that psychometric was based on personality science, even if it was completely up to date. It's based on science 80 years ago. The question is, how did it keep up with the time? And some psychometrics kept up more than others. So the question is, are you using a psychometric which gives you a snapshot in psychology 80 years ago? Or are you actually using a psychometric that has built on additional 80 years of research? And this is why it's important. So, for example, when you work with psychometric publishers, say what universities they work with as far as research, what kind of publish they recently published, or what side of corporations they're doing, and just to kind of make sure that they're taking steps to keep up with the research, and also ask how have they recently updated their tool based on this personality research which came out in the last couple of decades. So, does this research has an impact on how the assessment evolves? Because there's nothing wrong to have something with 80 years of pedigree, which evolves and develops over time. But if you're working with something that's been developed in 1940s, which didn't keep up with the time, you might be as well trying to browse internet on a black and white television. That's the analogy my mentor always said, Wendy. She said, when people say, well, it measures the same stuff. And you go, well, yeah, like you want to watch TV, you have an iPhone right now. You go to a shop that tries to sell you a black and white TV and say, it shows the same thing, it's just black and white, but still the same thing. And it's like, not quite. So there is that differentiation between for-profit psychometrics and psychology and personality science research. Now, we also need to look at the more longer pedigree, and that is time. So psychometrics and assessments of ability and personality is like seriously nothing new. In ancient China, and we're talking like BC, they've been using ability assessments to select for public service. They have even created little assessment booths where people could complete it. So ancient China had assessment centers. So it took like 2,000 years for the British Psychological Society to write out some guidelines. So, it's nothing particularly new. Then you have the zodiac. So I always feel the zodiac is the first personality assessment. It asks you one question: when are you born? And it gives you one of 12 types, such as a Leo, which I think is the best because I'm a Leo, clearly. So typical of a Leo to say this as well, I'm sure. But the key thing is, it's one question, you get 12 types, and all 12 types have a positive and a negative. And type-based tools have 16 types. It took us like 1,000 years to come up with an extra 4 types. And it's nothing new. Like, in AI right now is, what is called natural language processing. They look at the way you use your language and they identify patterns. Like, so before they looked at the stars to identify patterns, what it tells you about you as a person. Now we look at your Twitter feed for your patterns. What does it tell you? Humans love finding patterns to explain personality differences, be it with the zodiac or be it with AI right now. Then you have in 1920s, you had the DISC model, as I'm sure some of you are aware. If you want to know a little bit of background, the guy created DISC model of personality. He wrote a book called Emotions of Normal People. A guy called Marston, he also created Wonder Woman. And he also was the main protagonist behind the polygraph. Though there's debate who invented it. And the key thing is there that his model was that the true aspiration of a man was to be lovingly dominated by a woman. D stands for dominance, S stands for submissiveness. So I think, yeah, I'll let you think about that. There's even a film about him. But the key thing is he didn't create any psychometrics. DISC was inspired by his model as a tool, and the tool was created, I think, 40, 50 years later. So DISC is created on the model of Marston. Marston never created a psychometric, same as Jung never created a psychometric. MBTI is based on Jungian theory. And then in 1980s, you had the big five. You had Neo-PIR, OPQ, and like 2000, you have like gamified assessments and Luminous Spark. Now, the key thing is that all psychometrics have a place, and they all offer something. But it's really important to know when they were built, by whom, and why. Because as we continue, it becomes a little bit clearer. Because when it comes to saying that there's so many psychometrics out there, one of the most fascinating things that doesn't get talked about is the question of qualifications. Because in UK, you can attend a couple of days and you can get what's called level 1 and 2 of psychometric test use certificate, accredited with RQTU of the British Psychological Society, BPS. In South Africa, to be a psychometrician, you need 6 years experience, 6 years education, pardon. Specifically in occupational psychology and psychometry, and you also need like 6 months internship. So you need 6.5 years to become a psychometrist. In UK, to become a psychometrician, you need 3 days. Sorry, but I don't think Elon Musk's Neuralink is just quite there yet to allow you to download so much knowledge in such a short pace of time. And there's a reason for this. You notice the little gap of about 30 years here. You know why it's there? Because psychometrics have been actively used, bad psychometrics, to justify eugenics in 1930s. Eugenics and psychometrics are very close together in the beginning of 20th century. The guy who created the basic statistics behind psychometric theory of today, a guy called Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, he is called father of psychometrics and father of eugenics. And it's important to know that psychometrics can be used to justify really bad social policies. And then that explains why in South Africa, with apartheid, it was also used then. So in South Africa, that's why they're so really careful to make sure people use it the right way, because a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. So considering you're only getting qualified in a couple of days, this is a main issue, I think, in psychometrics right now, is that when you get qualified, you don't need any background in psychology. And you get one theory taught to you, the theory of the author of the assessment. And you get taught just this. You're not equipped with critical reasoning to actually assess, is it a good psychometric or not? Because you're only qualified in one. So I always say it's not a qualification, it's an indoctrination. You're indoctrinated in a particular line of thought about personality psychology in that particular tool, whatever it is. And, there's nothing wrong with this. You get qualified in one tool with a bare minimal level to actually start using this. But the question then becomes, is how much continual professional development that publisher is willing to provide for you and for how much. If your publisher just thinks it's okay to qualify somebody for 3 days and send you off on your way with zero support, wow, they were just trying to cram in literally thousands of years of history, psychology, personality research, not to mention ethics and how to use it, and discrimination and not to discriminate people, and all of this in 3 days, and provide you with zero support going forwards. Maybe not so great. And my also pro tip, if you ever try to get qualified in psychometric, always haggle. Never accept the first price, especially if you're a corporate. You even have more bargaining power. And if you're an independent, don't get qualified until you actually go through it. So what I mean by this is that never get qualified in assessment you have not taken yourself. So first, take the assessment. Ask a couple of your colleagues to complete it. See if it makes sense to them, what reservations they have. Ask the publisher to provide you with a feedback session to go through the assessment. Send it to a couple of more of your colleagues. See how it lands, because it needs to land. If people have issues with it, it's better to know it before you sign up. Identify which value it's going to bring to your organization, how it's going to be intertwined with your professional development, coaching, team workshops, even company values. I will make sure our values are worded in the ways that's attracted to all the different personality preferences. Or are we saying you need to be direct to people who already like being direct, and we tell that you need to be nice to people who are already nice to begin with? Or how about we actually phrase our values to appeal to the opposite traits, so it brings them a little bit closer to this way. So make sure if you're a company, don't just get qualified in assessment and sink like 30K into a qualification process for your HR team. How are we going to use it? Let's try it out. Let's get them to come in, show us the tools, how we can integrate it with our process. How can we make sure that this works for us rather than just getting qualified? And if you're an independent consultant, geez Louise, like don't pay 3K to get qualified straight away. First of all, experience the tool, see how it makes sense for you, complete it, get a couple of your colleagues, friends to complete it, see what they think. And then if you have a potential client, get them to complete it. And only after you signed off your next team build with that tool, get qualified. Because here's a little secret. About 40 to 50% of people who are independent practitioners, after getting qualified in the psychometric, never use it. And about 20 to 30% in corporates. And people, there's much cheaper ways to learn about personalities. There's really good books out there, like Why You Are Who You Are on Audible. by Leary. Brilliant book, 21 lectures on everything about you want to know about personality. And it's like 1 credit. And the first one is free. That's how they get you. And so if you're going to get qualified, make sure it's the right tool for you. Make sure you can make the most value out of it, and for your clients and for your colleagues, whether you're independent or working in the corporate. And even then, haggle for the best price rather than taking it at the first one. But yeah, Kelly, what are your thoughts? Just to get another voice in the room. I'm getting so.
Yeah. Well, I think firstly, just looking at the first 2 points in terms of the different time and qualification, that is kind of shocking to see written down. And I think that's just, yeah, it's really interesting the different ways where people can kind of seek out qualifications. But I do think kind of the point that resonated in terms of actually if you're trying it out for a corporate, you know, test it out, get feedback, kind of figure out if it's the right one for your organization in terms of what you're looking for. Interesting stat around the amount of people who are qualified and don't actually use the qualification as well. Is there a reason, or do you have any insight into what happens after that?
Well, nothing happens. And but the key thing is there's a couple of reasons why it happens.
Mm,
I think that from my experience, one, when people get with independent practitioners, it happens quite often because let's say you're a second career transition, you get a coaching qualification, so you just paid 15K to
mm,
become a coach. Whoop. And then you go, I need to get qualified in a psychometric because they keep telling me I need to get qualified in psychometric. So I'll call a psychometric publisher. Hi, I would like to get qualified in any assessment. And I go, whoa, you just said any. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Maybe you don't need a psychometric, but I want to work with personality. And you go, you can just ask your client, how would they describe their personality? And you can still explore that and upskill yourself without getting qualified. So quite often people get qualified and the psychometric is not quite in line with their coaching style. So they don't use it. So
mm.
it's very important if you're coaching or using for development, make sure you pair an assessment that's linked with your style. It's the right assessment for you and your clients. Of course, later on, I advise to get qualified in more assessments so you can broaden out your toolkit. But the first assessment, I think, needs to be quite aligned to what you're doing. Because quite often,
Yeah.
especially coaches who are just starting out, they think, oh, now I need to debrief the assessment. No, you don't. It's not about the report, damn it. Because the whole thing, what we're trying to measure with personality, for example, is the self-narrative of a person, the stories they tell themselves. And then you can see to what extent it shows up in the report or not. The report is not their personality. The report is biased. All psychometrics are biased. They're all created by humans. So whenever you see a LinkedIn post saying, remove bias, use a psychometric, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, neither of those words mean what you think it means. Because I have worked with a lot of publishers and talked to a lot of authors of psychometrics, and none has told me that they had divine intervention into the human condition, insight. No, they're just figuring out as best as they can. And therefore, quite often when you get a report, a psychometric report on a client, which is automatically generated, it sometimes tells you more about the author's opinions on personality than it does about the client sitting opposite you. So, and I think one of the key things how I kind of deal with that bias. First, I'm we'll get onto the next one. I always put the clients first. Like, how do you want to use psychometrics ethically? Look at the name, psychometrics, a measurement of a psychological construct. If we break down the word psyche, depending on which Wikipedia entry you read, it's about the individual as a divine light of within. And therefore, if you want to use psychometrics ethically, the first step is follow the name. Do you put the interest of the person first and foremost? Do you put the person first and foremost, your client? So do you do them justice as best as you can? So I would always start up a session, doesn't matter what assessment I use, was how would you describe your personality? People say, no, I'm extroverted, neurotic, all of that good stuff. And they go, well, tell me more about this, how it plays out. And only after we kind of establish that, they felt heard, I would open up the report and we'll see how their self-narrative compares or contrasts with the data within the report. So yeah. And any other thoughts, Kelly, at this point?
I feel like I'm a sponge at the moment, taking it all in. No, I think the only other question I was just going to ask you, kind of based on what you were saying, is if maybe some advice for anyone who is kind of, we'll say, a consultant or a coach at the moment, and they're kind of like the person you mentioned, they ring up a publisher and it's like, any test, like how might someone go about like figuring out which one aligns to their style? Is there a place they can go from like a resource perspective, or is it really just researching what's out there?
Well, you can research what's out there, I would suggest. So you can go like personality assessments, create a folder on your desktop. So request freebies from all the different publishers, complete them. Ask each publisher to provide you with a feedback session. So for somebody from them to call you and go through your results. Keep a little spreadsheet with your notes on the assessments and your impressions of this. And, and then also the pricing, and like make top three, and then send it to a couple of people who will be in your client group. See what their opinions on the assessments are and the output. See how easy it would be for you to practice with it. And then, just decide which one you'd go for now, and maybe add the other ones later. But just do it a little bit systematically, and also agree what CPD can be provided. So for example, like after you get qualified, when I was qualifying people, I would always offer free second opinion. So people would call in with a portrait anonymized, and we just go through it. And so I'll ask them to give their opinions and say, well, what I'm also seeing this here, maybe this question would be interesting. They do the coaching session. We have a follow-up call. What went on? What was the questions? And another couple of sessions like this. So create yourself a little CPD afterwards. Pair up with ask if a publisher has a community of practice, like community, hire, very useful, and see what other people you can connect with and learn from, and how you're going to develop your journey, which books you're going to read. So even after you get certified, create yourself a little syllabus of CPD and also community element to make sure you get the most value out of the psychometric, both for yourself as a practitioner, but also for your clients.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have a question from an audience member. Shall we take it now? Or do you want to wait till the end?
I'd love a question.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So we've got one from Maya, which is in terms of an individual taking a test, maybe with a coach in their business. But what if the person taking the test, if their view on their personality contradicts the report that they're given?
Brilliant. Disagreement is fantastic, because if a client disagrees with their report, it means they're engaged. So, and you can say, well, I disagree with this. Psychometric I use has the word tough, which is all about being disagreeable. And often people go, I'm not tough. Can't you understand? And you go, fascinating. How would you describe yourself? So the key thing is, quite often people defend the report. You're not the author of it. It's automatically generated. Who cares? The thing is, you pick the best assessment as you could, but now it's the value of the conversation. So you can say, okay, how would you describe yourself? Is there anybody who would describe you as tough? Did this ever come up? So you don't need to go on the defensive. It's actually so much more fun to explore it from a curious perspective. Like, yeah, and sometimes I maybe had it a couple of times, but quite often what psychometrics, especially is there's some psychometrics that make a difference, but I think personality exists on 4 levels. It exists on what you like, what you enjoy, such as I like to tell people how I feel. It exists on what you do, which is more contextual, is behavior. It's like I often tell people how I feel. And, it exists also on the level of maladaptive, what you do too much sometimes. You might be tired or had too much coffee, hence decaf. And it's like, I can be so expressive with my feelings. Other people have told me I can be overbearing. Or, I can be so focused on needs of others to a point neglect my own. And there can be also another one, which is aspirational. Like, I should tell people less how I feel. So there's this levels, and sometimes people differ quite a lot. So, and the first sign of this can be when people go, well, Nikita, I completed lots of these assessments, but can you answer me one question? Is this my home self or my work self? And I go, fascinating. How's it different? Because we all manage our personality, all of us, to some extent. We're different with our family members, friends, colleagues, and that's normal. And people who don't change are often described as strong personalities. But I always feel that all of this is authentic. So we adapt based on the circumstances and people around us. Some people might call it emotional intelligence. But the key thing here is that some people might more adapt than others. So let's say with a person like who says this, you can say, well, is there any aspect of your personality you manage at work about you? Why do you think it's necessary to do so? So sometimes a report, if a person manages themselves a lot, the results might be a little bit skewed, because quite often psychometrics ask you those questions, what you like, what you do, and then kind of collapse them into the single score. But a person can be quite flexible and adaptable, and this can be this could be one of the reasons it's showing up. Or it can also be that people had negative experience with psychometrics before, because with so little training, people can take a lot of license on how they use them. I had one client who was accused of being a liar based on their type assessment, because the only way they could get these results if their family loved them unconditionally as a child. So the coach thought they must be lying. And that person did not come in very high spirited to the feedback coaching session. So if they come in quite disagreeable and angry, they only met you. First question is, have you done psychometrics before? Because they might have encountered their friends being made redundant based on malpractice about use of psychometrics. They might have encountered selection processes which were unfair, and the justification was psychometric results. People might have run into psychometrics before, and that's what kind of shaped their impression of them. And this is what's super important if you use them for development and selection, the buildings of psychological contract. Because quite often, I have companies who spend hundreds of thousands on the leadership development program and with use psychometrics. But when the individual delegate gets the email to complete, it just says, just do it, like Nike logo. Not the best way to form a psychological contract. Great for shoes and sportswear, not so much inviting people to complete personality assessments. And even just by tweaking this and explaining why it's being done, how the data is being used. And I have a good friend, Ben Williams. I'd also suggest you follow him from Stand 10. He runs this thing called Assessment Agony Uncle. So if you want to kind of just psychologically safe space to express frustration, I love that. Usually I need to pay my therapist for that. And basically there he gives examples, like they had one assessment where the invitation was sent out and then demographic diversity dropped. So only people from particular demographics proceeded with the assessment. And people from different demographics filtered themselves out. They didn't even click on it. So they made the invitation much more personable, much nicer, and they had a huge spike in participation from different demographics. So even in how you write the message, be it for selection or be it for development, in how you start building that psychological contract will impact the value you get from the assessment, and hopefully also prevent people from being too disagreeable. But hey, it might be within their personality. So then, just a little bit of stats. I promise, only 2 minutes. So all these publishers tell you about validity and reliability. And the best way is to describe it as like a little dartboard. So validity, if you want to identify correlation with performance, is like, do you hit a bullseye? Reliability, does it hit at the same place again and again and again? Like, does your personality scores change over time? The answer is yes, but it depends on the tool. But the key thing is that often people go, our assessment is correlated with performance. Where? When? What performance? Just because you have correlated with performance of bus drivers is not going to be middle management and FTSE 500 or vice versa. When people say, oh yeah, the correlation with performance is 0.3, you know what that is? It's not 30%. It's 9% because it's 3 multiplied by 3 squared. And then we get like it's 0.9. And then that's like, no, the best way is, let's say 0.4. 0.4 is the highest, which I've seen. So correlation with performance of 0.4 means 16% of performance variation between individuals can be explained by the assessment and what it measures. 16%, still better than nothing, but it's not a hell of a lot. But it's still there. But the question is, what performance, when, which groups, how relevant it is to your company, and just asking those questions and talking about questions. This is something that I don't see that often, but always check the items. Ask for a printout of the questions your clients are being asked. There could be so many weird questions which are being asked which don't make sense. And if they don't make sense to you, they're not likely to make sense to your delegates. And if they don't make sense to your delegates, it's also questionable how is it related to the constructs they claim to measure. So, and if the publisher doesn't want to share the questions with you, the question is why. So always look at the items. Some items are not updated for a long time. If you're using us for this for selection or development cross-culturally and nationally, get some, if you're gonna say, we're gonna have like Italian, Japanese, and English. Get some of your colleagues to complete the Japanese assessment first, some of your Italian colleagues to complete the Italian first, and say, did those questions make sense? Did something pick up on this? Because sometimes it's you really need to look at this, because the assessment is only as good as the questions, because it's from the questions that we gather that data. So always check them. Yeah, translates. Thank you, Eric. How do you deal with different assessments? Have heard from feedback that was not great. Yeah, some assessments are better at this, some not, but the only way is to check. So if you're going to do a wide rollout, so if you're going to get qualified in psychometric as a company and you're going to roll it out across your locations, have like a sample group of people who like completing these assessments, and they do exist. Kelly has just disclosed herself as one. So people exist who like to complete surveys. So get a bunch of these people from different locations and get them to complete it, and then have a little focus group. Now, by the way, what's really important is focus groups. So whether you use selection or development, have focus groups in your company to come together to describe how the selection process was, to what we can actually learn from it. Or if you have rolled it out for development, get a few people going through the coaching with this assessment. Again, how the process is going for you, what's your feedback, and liaise that feedback to the publisher. Because it's important to see what's happening for us, how we're working together, how is this valuable to us, and it's continuous. So, okay, here's a few more questions, then we'll put it up to questions and takeaways. Okay, so tool, when you encounter a psychometric tool, questions to ask the publisher. When was the tool built? Why and by whom? Because it's important to know the stats, but it's also important to know the biographies of the authors and what they were trying to measure. And is what they're trying to measure in the 20s and 40s as relevant as then than it is today? Now, by the way, look, Zodiac has been existing for thousands of years plus, depending on which wiki entry you read, and you still see it in papers. People still are interested in this and hopefully derive some sort of value. But the key thing is that what's important is that the tools kept up with the times. They've been updated, they've been researched. And yeah, as I said, some of these pedigree tools have more research and validity and scientific rigor behind them than more newer tools on the market. Now, those new tools hopefully will accumulate this over time, but it's still worth asking what questions they're doing. Also, when was the last time the items were updated? Human language changes. So the BPS guidelines, British Psychological Society, that every 10 years you need to update the items of the questionnaire because the language changed. Like, I love to be asked if I'm lackadaisical. I think lackadaisical is like one of the best words in English, right there next to shenanigans. But some people might not get lackadaisical, especially if the English is a second language and they're not over a certain age. Is it being updated? Is the tool reviewed by a professional body, such as a BPS, RKTU? There's other professional bodies out there. And if not, why not? Some publishers still gathering data to get the review going. So there's nothing wrong with that. The more data you have, the better is your review. You'll get like many stars. So it's not necessarily a red flag. It hasn't been reviewed, but is it going to be reviewed? And can you have access to this review? So try to get a third-party review of the assessment. Also, potentially hire yourself an occupational psychology consultant who has lots of experience in psychometrics who can give you that opinion. What is the support provided by the publisher and the CPD, as we discussed? What are the key issues people run into when using this assessment? The publisher should know this. If they say the assessment is perfect, to paraphrase the ending of Some Like It Hot, which is a brilliant film, nobody's perfect. And now here's a little one for you. and that is research on impact of neurodiversity on the response patterns. Because we talk a lot about neurodiversity and ability assessments, but not so much with personality. There's a growing body of evidence, just two of them, that personality and neurodiversity conditions are connected. So people who score on ADHD or autism, their responses on personality assessments are going to be slightly different, which is an issue that if you put in cutoff scores for particular personality scores, you might be cutting people out based on their neurodiverse condition. And that's a little bit choppy in more ways than one, plus unethical. And therefore ask the publishers what sort of stuff they're doing in order to research this, address this, and mitigate this. And if they say there's no difference between people responding with who are neurodiverse and neurotypical, you can send them a couple of these papers and you can go show me the study which actually showed this was your assessment. Don't take their word at this. There's a growing body of evidence, and it's only going to take one court case and precedent, if it's not already there, to really kind of to change things. And I think this is going to come sooner or later. So yeah, then a couple of other things when you use assessments, especially cutoff scores or personality. Look at the impact on your ecosystem of talent. Because let's say the issue is that a lot of psychometrics go, all right, let's take sales teams because we love sales teams because they're KPIs, baby. Sales. It's quite easy to correlate this with performance. And we'll find that low agreeable extroverts make the best salesmen in our current team based on past performance of the last 10 years. So what we're going to do, we're going to hire low agreeable extroverts. And because that's better. So you start hiring it. So you start upsetting this diversity of talent and personalities. And maybe you find out later on that the reason they had the highest KPIs is because they took credit more for the sales. But, we're a little bit on the side. Maybe the other person can take it, but they're like, oh, I'll take them. They're not using the brownie points. And then you're just selecting this. And then what happens when you just select for low agreeable extroversion? What happens when all your sales team is like this? We don't know. And make sure you look into this. And the key issue is that when people correlate, it's past performance. So really, with our change in world, what worked in the last 10 years is what's going to work in the next 10. We don't know. Make sure you watch for this. You watch for performance. You watch for selection. You look for diversity. And if you select particular personality traits, it's going to change the culture. Those low agreeableness extroverts will go down to when they start upsetting people. What they're going to do? They're going to go to the bar. They're going to sit with other extroverts, low agreeableness, and they're going to go, I wasn't too harsh, was I? And the other one's going to go, no, you weren't. They were just too emotional. They're overreacting. Plus, if they think they have it hard, they have no idea how we had it in our 20s. So you start developing this groupthink, and then that kind of other impacts and recognition bias that people will start recognizing only their traits. And, that can escalate quickly, man. So be careful of unintentional consequences, especially of introducing psychometrics, which favors some traits over the others, cutoff scores. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying that you need to watch for unintentional consequences. And I don't know, unintentional consequences are very hard because they're unintentional, but just I would recommend you still watch out for them. And if you say, Nikita, scrap this, we just want to use personality assessments. That's it. I hate to break it to you, but even if you don't use personality assessments, people will still be assessing your personality because they just won't have a model. They'll say, well, of course, they scratch their nose. And my grandmother always says you can't trust people who scratch their nose. Oh, I know they're a Leo. My ex was a Leo. Can't marry them. Can't live with them. Because people use personality. We have a drive for this, be it the zodiac, be it AI, be it self-report, be it 360. We really like to actually categorize that elephant and break it down in bits and try to understand and navigate this world of individual differences of people around us. And hopefully from today, you found something useful and something that you can take away, but we still have 5 minutes. And so, any questions?
So
Menti,
we have a few questions here in the chat. So as Nikita said, feel free to pop us in questions just for the last few moments. But we've got one from Tanya, and she's asking, if we inherit a psychometric assessment from a client that has already invested in one, how do we ensure the tool is being used with minimal bias? Or how do we coach hiring managers to not use psychometrics as a be all end all observational tool?
Absolutely, it's a fantastic question because sometimes you don't have control over what psychometric you use, and you just inherit it. So I would suggest, first of all, look at the data if the data was being gathered on biases. So, are we selecting for particular personality traits? How bad is the impact of this? And are we actually gathering this data at all? Preferably, if you have put candidates through, and as part of onboarding, just ask them questions about the selection process, maybe even in a little group. So start gathering data on the experience. Also, talk to the publisher of what sort of data they can provide you with, so how they can make your life a little bit easier. Um, and and start looking around also what other assessments can be used. And then if you can't use anything like that, I would suggest just an upskill workshop for the hiring managers. Get them together, ask them how they're using psychometrics. Because one of the founders of psychometric personality theory, called Allport, he has one of my favorite quotes. He says, if I want to know something about somebody, I ask them. So if we want to understand how hiring managers are using them, get a group together, ask them what their experience is. They might not be using it as be all and end all. And then you can say, okay, what's the issues you have found? What has been the benefits of this? And create a learning community so they can learn from each other as a process of this. Then you can, for example, create a little learning group, meets once a quarter, coffee and psychometrics. Then you can invite somebody from the publisher to come in and present on what the findings, so the hiring managers can reflect on this and share what their experience with this is. But I think people are quite reasonable in most cases. Some people go, you need to hire this and not that. But actually, you might be surprised in some cases how little or how much value people give to the psychometric result. A lot of hiring managers might not even read it. Other people read it first before the session and then ask biased questions based on this because they know it's right, because they've seen people with this profile before and they always respond in this way. But until we get them together to learn from each other, we won't know that. And this is why I think it's really important that after you roll out a psychometric in a company or you inherit one, you actually, okay, how are we learning from each other, how we're using this? How are we creating an internal center of expertise? Or are we just using it and the data is stored and we're not mining it? Also, another fun thing you can check is personality of applicants, because hypothetically, maybe your job descriptions are appealing to particular personality traits, and then you that's the only people you recruit because that's the only people that apply. So maybe you can crack a little bit of that of data to get a little bit of value out of it, and you go, okay, maybe we attract only the high extroverts with our fast-paced environment and must have a good sense of humor and all of this, and why are we not getting any neurodivergent applicants? And then go, okay, what if we rephrase the applications? Can we then look, does it impact the personality scores of the new applicants? So you can even play around with that, or where is the jobs advertised? And I think that even if you inherit a psychometric, you can still make sure you get the most value out of it and make sure that the hiring managers are using it the best way possible, but also what sort of additional data you can mine from this in order to inform things like writing CVs or your application process. You can ask people who rate your application process, and maybe then, with their permission, of course, correlate it with their personality. And you go, oh, our candidate experience is favoring any particular trait of personalities. So maybe there's the only ones that are likely to stay the distance. So, they first applies and selects and is likely to stay the distance. So, maybe we're not getting the most diversity we can of personality. Hopefully that
Amazing.
answers your question, Tanya.
We're just at time, but maybe we've got one last question. If we can maybe answer it super quickly, or kind of give a few pointers for Maya in terms of where she can maybe look. So the question is how to use psychometrics in team settings.
Fantastic question. One of my favorites. The key thing is that it's what's really important is mm, 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 um, use a psychometric which doesn't make judgments of good and bad, because it depends ultimately. So old psychology joke. Any questions answer it depends, because it does. We don't know what personality traits work in one situation or other. Use tools which are neutral, which are not likely to reinforce existing biases individuals have. use tools which respect all the different traits and acknowledge that everything can be overplayed. Build a good psychological contract with the team, potentially have one-to-one sessions ahead of the team build. Don't make team builds longer than 2 to 3 hours. No one the hell wants to sit 6 hours through it. I'm obsessed with psychometrics, but even I see 6 hours too much. So make like 2 little sessions and ask people to suggest what little changes are going to make between the first and the second one. So then on the second session, you start with what people changes have they made and tried out and seen things differently. So create a little development program out of it. But yeah, if you're interested in this, I'm always happy to chat about team use. Now, Danielle, thank you so much. I completely forgot about SJTs. You're absolutely right. So I'm so happy you mentioned that it's situational judgment tests are also psychometrics. As values as fits, sift, and selection, drop off is suggestion, a safe, conscious of neurotypical. So cartoon images, support sentiment, any views. Yeah, if battling a high bottleneck of applications, I would suggest, yeah, there's different formats you can process SJTs. Some do audio, some do cartoons, some do visuals. I know one guy who does SJTs in Japan using anime. That's what his consultancy does. And there's different ones you can play out and see what happens. We have recently hosted an event on neurodiversity and assessment. I will be posting a link to it soon as well. And one of the things is discussed as SJTs in it as well. So yeah, hopefully
Amazing.
that sort of answers your question, but it is hot and I'm running out of tea. And
That was amazing, Nikita. That was such an insightful webinar. For anyone who's keen to relook, the replay will still be available, so you can kind of always go back, write some notes, share it with anyone you think would enjoy it as well. But thank you so much for your time, Nikita. That was really, really great, and I think it was something that a lot of the community have been asking for. So just to wrap up, like we said earlier, please feel free to come and join us at Hire if you work in internal TA or HR. We are a free community to join. We can continue this conversation inside the Slack channel as well. We always have some good conversations. There's various interest groups. We have things like discussing sourcing, discussing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and lots of channels around best practice as well. So please do come and join us. We would love to see you there. And finally, just to say that next week we have another webinar, same time, same place. So we've got Millie and Stacey from Oyster joining us, and we'll be talking all around how to look at global compensation and employment. So tune in to understand how you can turn your aspirations for a global team into a reality. And that's at 4 o'clock UK time and 8 o'clock PST. But for now, Nikita, thanks a million for your time today. And hopefully everyone else, we will see you at the next webinar next week. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you so much, Kelly,
Bye.
for organizing and running this. Always happy to connect. All the best.
Amazing. See you
Thank you for
later,
your wonderful
everyone.
questions.